Right now, somewhere on Earth, someone is cracking open a beer, pouring a glass of wine, or mixing a drink they definitely don't need on a Tuesday. It's one of the most universal human habits there is. Basically, every culture on the planet, at some point in its history, figured out how to get itself drunk. Doesn't matter if they had writing, farming, or even permanent houses yet. Somehow, someone always found a way to make the good stuff first. Which is weird if you actually stop and think about it. Getting drunk is expensive. It wastes food. It messes with your balance, your judgment, and your ability to run away from a lion. So here's the question that should be bugging you. Why does a species that supposedly evolved to survive keep going out of its way to poison itself for fun, on purpose, over and over again, for thousands of years running, across basically every continent, completely independently, like it's a rule somewhere and nobody bothered to tell the rest of us? And here's the part that's going to ruin your next dinner party fact drop. Humans didn't invent the desire to get drunk. We just got really, really good at satisfying an urge that's millions of years older than we are. This isn't a humans are broken story. It's a story about an appetite that's been quietly running in the background of our biology since long before there was a we to talk about it. Let's start with the part nobody expects. Long before there were humans, before there was fire, before there was anything you'd recognize as an ancestor, there were fruit-eating primates living in forests. And some of that fruit was rotting. Rotting fruit ferments. Fermentation produces alcohol. And it turns out our extremely distant relatives developed a taste for it, way before anyone was around to card them at the door, or asked to see some kind of prehistoric ID. In 2015, a team led by biologist Matthew Kerrigan looked at a gene called ADH4, which codes for an enzyme that breaks down alcohol in your mouth, throat, and stomach before it even reaches your bloodstream. Sort of like a bouncer standing at the very front door of your digestive system. Comparing this gene across 18 different primate species, they found something wild. Around 10 million years ago, a single tiny mutation showed up in the last common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That one mutation made this enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol. 40 times. Not a small upgrade. A full system overhaul, and one that happened purely by accident, long before anyone was trying to build a better drinker. Here's why that timing matters. 10 million years ago is roughly when our ancestors started spending a lot more time on the ground instead of up in the trees. And down on the ground is exactly where all the overripe, fermenting fruit ends up. The stuff that's fallen, split open, and started brewing itself into a low-grade, natural booze. Biologist Robert Dudley, who first proposed this whole idea back in 2000, calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument is refreshingly blunt. Our ancestors weren't accidentally stumbling onto alcohol every once in a while. They were built, quite literally, to handle it. Because handling it meant they could safely eat more of the ripest, most calorie-dense fruit around. The stuff every other animal in the forest was also fighting over. And this isn't just an ancient rumor dug up from old bones. Researchers studying wild chimpanzees in Uganda and Ivory Coast found they're regularly eating fruit containing real ethanol, adding up to something like 14 grams of alcohol a day just from their normal diet. That's roughly one full bottle of beer's worth, every single day. And they're not stumbling around the forest like it's last call at closing time. Their bodies are just quietly, efficiently processing it as fuel, the same way yours processes a piece of toast. Other primates take this even further. Slow lorises and aye-ayes, two genuinely strange-looking creatures most people have never heard of, seek out fermented nectar specifically. And when researchers gave them a choice between weaker and stronger concentrations of alcohol in a controlled taste test, both species reliably went straight for the strongest option on the menu. Nobody taught them that. Nobody handed them a cocktail list. It's just what their biology was already quietly wired to prefer. Even spider monkeys in Panama have been caught doing something similar, seeking out specific fruit trees known for higher natural alcohol content over neighboring trees with the exact same fruit at lower concentrations, which is either impressive taste discrimination or the animal kingdom's oldest ongoing bar crawl, depending on how generous you're feeling. So by the time actual Homo sapiens shows up on the scene, we're not starting from zero. We're inheriting a body that already knows exactly what to do with alcohol, and a brain that's already primed to enjoy it. The appetite came first. The invention came millions of years later. Humans didn't discover the desire to drink. We were just the first species smart enough to stop waiting around for fruit to rot on its own schedule, and start rotting things ourselves, on purpose, whenever we felt like it. Which brings us to the part where things get interesting, because once humans figured out how to make alcohol on purpose, instead of just waiting around for fruit to rot, they got really committed to it, shockingly fast. In 2018, archaeologists working in Raqefet Cave near modern-day Haifa in Israel found something that broke the timeline everyone assumed was true. Inside the cave, which had been used by a hunter-gatherer people called the Natufians as a burial site, researchers found stone mortars carved directly into the rock, dozens of them, some clearly used for storing food, others showing a very different kind of wear pattern. Chemical analysis of the residue left behind showed something specific: starch and plant fragments consistent with malting, mashing, and fermenting wheat and barley into an early form of beer. Not a fine craft lager, to be clear. Researchers who recreated the recipe in a lab described it as closer to a thin, sour porridge than anything you'd order at a bar today. But it was beer, chemically speaking, and the date on it, according to lead researcher Li Liu of Stanford University, was roughly 13,000 years ago. Here's why that number should stop you in your tracks. Agriculture, actual organized farming, doesn't show up in this same region for another 1,000 or 2,000 years. These people were brewing beer before they were farming grain on purpose. They were foraging wild wheat and barley, specifically to turn it into alcohol, years before anyone planted a single seed on purpose. Picture that for a second. An entire community putting serious, sustained effort into gathering enough wild grain, storing it properly, and carefully managing a multi-step fermentation process, purely to get a beverage, at a point when nobody on Earth had figured out farming was even a viable long-term lifestyle yet. That's not a lazy afterthought. That's dedication. This lines up with something archaeologists have argued about for over 60 years. Sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis. The idea that the desire to keep a steady, reliable supply of alcohol on hand might have been one of the actual motivations that pushed humans toward domesticating grain in the first place. To be upfront about it, this isn't a settled slam dunk theory. Plenty of archaeologists think bread, porridge, and basic calories were still the bigger driver, and that beer was a happy side effect rather than the whole point. But the Raqefet Cave findings gave the beer-first camp a genuinely strong piece of evidence, since this beer wasn't a byproduct of farming. It came first. As Li Liu and her team put it in their own published research, beer brewing may have been, at least in part, an underlying motivation to start cultivating cereal grains in the region at all, adding actual weight to a hypothesis that had spent decades being treated as more of a fun bar trivia claim than serious archaeology. And the Natufians weren't drinking alone in some quiet, practical way either. The context researchers found this beer in wasn't a kitchen, it was a graveyard. The mortars sat right alongside human burials, and the scale of the operation, big stone basins clearly built for batches far larger than one thirsty person could drink, points toward large group feasts tied to funerals and ritual, not some prehistoric guy quietly unwinding after a hard day of foraging. This same cave, it turns out, had already surprised archaeologists once before. Earlier excavations found that the Natufians buried their dead on actual beds of flowers, carefully arranged plant matter pressed into the stone beneath the bodies. Put those two discoveries together, and you get a strikingly specific picture. These people marked death with flowers under the body and beer passed around above it, a level of ceremonial care that most people would never guess belonged to hunter-gatherers who hadn't invented farming yet. Halfway around the world, completely independently, the same thing was happening. In China's Yellow River Valley, at a site called Jiahu, archaeochemist Patrick McGovern analyzed residue soaked into 9,000-year-old pottery and found chemical traces of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, or wild grape, all fermented together into an early mixed alcoholic drink. Two completely unconnected regions of the ancient world, thousands of miles apart, independently arrived at the exact same idea within a couple thousand years of each other. Take whatever sugary plant matter you've got, let it rot on purpose, and drink the result. And it wasn't just the old world. Across the ocean, entirely separately, Mesoamerican peoples were doing their own version of the exact same experiment. Long before European contact, cultures in what's now central Mexico were fermenting the sap of the agave plant into a milky, slightly sour drink called pulque, a practice so old and so central to daily life that the Aztecs eventually built an entire mythology around it, complete with a whole pantheon of deities specifically dedicated to drunkenness, including one god believed to preside over the 400 rabbits, a wonderfully specific way of representing the 400 different possible moods and behaviors a person might display once they'd had enough pulque. 400 separate personality types of drunk, apparently, was considered a reasonable and necessary number to mythologize. 3 completely separate civilizations, on 3 separate continents, with zero contact with each other, all independently arrived at, let's ferment the local plant and build a religion around what happens next. Once civilizations actually got organized, alcohol didn't fade into a minor hobby. It became infrastructure, woven into wages, medicine, religion, and government policy all at once, which is a lot of responsibility to place on a drink that started life as an accident involving overripe fruit. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't a luxury item. It was closer to a basic utility, like water or bread, and it shows up constantly in the archaeological and textual record as a form of payment. The laborers who built the pyramids at Giza were regularly paid in beer alongside bread, as part of their standard daily wages, not as some special bonus.
We're talking multiple liters a day per worker as a completely normal part of the job. The ancient equivalent of a company handing out water bottles on a hot day, except the water bottles were mildly alcoholic and everyone was fine with that. Beer even had its own mythology. Egyptians told a story about the goddess Sekhmet, a lioness-headed deity who nearly wiped out humanity in a fit of divine rage, only to be stopped when the other gods dyed a massive batch of beer blood red and left it in her path. She drank it, mistaking it for blood, got magnificently drunk, and passed out before she could finish the job, saving humanity essentially by accident through the ancient world's most consequential hangover. Egyptian medical texts, including the famous Eber's Papyrus, also prescribe beer, sometimes mixed with various herbs, as a treatment for dozens of ailments, from digestive trouble to fever.
Beer wasn't just something Egyptians drank to unwind after a long day of dragging enormous rocks around in the desert heat. It was something their doctors handed out. The Romans, meanwhile, took a slightly more anxious approach to the whole thing. Wine was everywhere in Roman life, watered down and consumed constantly by basically everyone from senators to slaves. But the Romans were also weirdly nervous about what alcohol did to social order once people started drinking it together, outside official control. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate passed a formal decree, known today as the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, specifically cracking down on the Bacchanalia, wine-fueled ritual gatherings devoted to the god Bacchus, after officials became convinced these late-night parties had spiraled into a genuine threat to public order. According to the Roman historian Livy, writing decades later, tens of thousands of people across Italy were eventually implicated, and the Senate moved to tightly restrict who could even hold these gatherings going forward, right down to capping how many people were legally allowed to attend one at a time. This wasn't really about the wine itself. It was about what happened when a few thousand people got hold of it at the same time, outside anyone's supervision, which is a genuinely funny thing for one of history's most powerful governments to be quietly terrified of. Here's a genuinely strange twist, though, that most people never hear about. Not every population on Earth inherited this ancient drinking-friendly biology equally. And the reason why comes down to a completely different mutation, one that showed up far more recently. A large percentage of people with East Asian ancestry carry a variant of a gene called ALDH2, which handles the second step of breaking down alcohol in the body. In people with this variant, that second step barely works at all. So a toxic byproduct called acetaldehyde builds up in the bloodstream almost immediately after drinking, causing flushing, a racing heart, nausea, and general misery, often after just one drink. Researchers sometimes call this alcohol flush reaction, and less formally, plenty of people just call it the Asian glow. Geneticists estimate this mutation arose somewhere in southern China, roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. And some researchers have floated the idea that it may have spread specifically because it made rice-based alcohol taste and feel unpleasant enough to modestly discourage overconsumption in a population that was, by then, deep into large-scale rice farming and rice wine production. In other words, at almost the exact same time some ancient humans were busy building rice wine culture in China, evolution may have been quietly trying to hand a chunk of that same population a built-in reason to slow down. It didn't stop anyone from drinking rice wine anyway, obviously, but it's a strange little reminder that our relationship with alcohol has never been one single uniform story. Different branches of the same species have been fighting slightly different biological battles with the exact same ancient appetite the whole time. So here's what this all actually means, and it's a bit more unsettling than people have always liked booze. The urge itself, the pull toward that specific, buzzy, warm, slightly reckless feeling, isn't a modern invention, and it isn't even a human invention. It's a 10-million-year-old inheritance from fruit-eating ancestors who needed a reliable way to process the ripest, most valuable calories in their environment without keeling over. Every single thing that came after, beer, wine, mead, the entire multi-billion-dollar industry currently advertising to you during football games, is just increasingly sophisticated machinery built to satisfy an appetite that showed up in our lineage long before anything you'd call human existed at all. Think about the sheer distance covered here. It starts with a hairy, tree-dwelling animal eating a piece of fruit that's a little too far gone. Ends up, tens of millions of years later, with Roman senators drafting actual legislation about how many citizens are legally allowed to attend a wine party at once. Somewhere in the middle, an entire genetic subplot plays out in East Asia, where evolution seemingly tries to slow a whole population down with a built-in nausea button, only for that population to keep drinking rice wine anyway, because apparently once the appetite's in there, biology has to work pretty hard to talk you out of it. 10 million years of appetite, roughly 13,000 years of deliberate brewing, and one single unbroken thread connecting all of it, directly to whatever's in your hand the next time you raise a glass to absolutely nothing in particular. Agriculture didn't create the desire for alcohol. If anything, in at least some regions, the desire for alcohol may have helped nudge agriculture into existence in the first place. Civilization didn't invent drinking. It just got dramatically, terrifyingly efficient at supplying it, going from occasionally lucky fruit on a forest floor to Roman senators trying to legislate how many people were allowed to party together on a given night. So the next time you crack open a drink, or watch someone else do it, you're not looking at some kind of moral failing unique to modern life. And you're definitely not looking at something civilization invented to make itself miserable.
You're looking at the tail end of a genuinely ancient story, one that started with a distant, hairy ancestor of yours, standing under a fruit tree millions of years ago, eating something a little too ripe, feeling something a little too good, and somehow passing that exact appetite down, person to person, generation to generation, all the way to whatever's sitting in your fridge right now. 10 million years of quiet biological momentum, and it all lands every single time in a plastic cup at somebody's backyard barbecue. If there's one thing worth sitting with here, it's how little of this was ever a plan. Nobody sat down 10 million years ago and decided humanity should have a complicated relationship with alcohol. A gene mutated. Some fruit fell off a tree and rotted a little. A few thousand years later, someone in a cave figured out mashed grain plus thyme plus wild yeast equals something worth building your whole ritual calendar around. None of it was designed. All of it still somehow ended up exactly here, in your kitchen, in your fridge, in the very specific, very old itch that shows up right around 5 o'clock on a Friday. If you liked digging into the weird, ancient roots of something you'd never think twice about, there's plenty more where that came from. New videos on the strange original reasons behind everyday human habits drop regularly, so go ahead and subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one.